All right, so now let's review the lower respiratory tract or lower respiratory system starting at the level of the larynx. So remember, all right, so this is saying lower, and I said that the larynx is a part of the upper, so let's come back over here. Remember, I said I was going to draw it right here. There are different versions of this book that talk about lower and upper respiratory. I'm going to include larynx in the upper. Right now, I just want to talk about how it works. So what is the larynx doing? It conducts air from the pharynx to the trachea through what we call, just kind of the voice box. I'm making sure that my ink pen is working here. Air leaves the pharynx through the glottis, and so the glottis itself is going to be, you can see that externally when somebody swallows. So the larynx surrounds and protects the glottis itself. The glottis is like it looks like a large lump in your throat. The larynx is a tube that's made of lots and lots of cartilage. The cartilage is supported by ligaments and skeletal muscles. Some of those ligaments and muscles, as you recall, are little tiny when we were looking at the skeleton. So here's over here the vestibular ligament. The vestibular ligament has nothing to do with the ear, you guys. So here's the vocal ligament and cartilage associated with thyroid cartilage over here that helps us make vocalizations. So the anterior view, you can see the outside of the larynx. Okay, the laryngeal prominence is the lump in your throat. The hyoid bone is way up high here. Remember, we were looking at the hyoid bone when we were talking about the skeleton. And then down here, we have these circular pieces of tracheal cartilage holding the trachea open so that air can travel smoothly through the larynx. So the cartilage of the larynx, we start with the thyroid cartilage, which is also called the Adam's apple. It's kind of the popular name. It's the largest piece of cartilage. The epiglottis itself is the gating that helps the passage of air or fluid and food as you swallow. So one end of it is fixed and the other is attached to thyroid cartilage. And so basically the epiglottis can move up and down to gate the movement of air or fluids back and forth through the respiratory tract or the esophagus. The cricoid cartilage is attached to the first tracheal ring, which helps hold the passageway open. And then we have other paired pieces of cartilage. We have the arytenoid cartilage, which is superior to those little rings. And basically all of these pieces of cartilage are very important in keeping the glottis open for sound production. And then I forgot to mention the cartilage. The cuneiform cartilage is between the folds. So let's come back here. Here we go. Are between the individual pieces of, I guess you would say, connective tissue, the ligaments. And so basically this large piece of cartilage is below the laryngeal cartilage, and it's the second largest piece. So what does the glottis look like? So the glottis, when it's open, allows air to travel over the vestibular fold. The vestibular fold is a part of the laryngeal system, and it's associated with the vocal folds. The vocal folds are actually your basically it's your voice box here. And so as air flows over the vocal folds, the folds vibrate, and the vibrations give rise to the sounds that we recognize as communication. It's our tongue and our upper respiratory system that allows us to make the sounds of vowels and words and so forth. But basically the glottis, as it's closed, will vibrate at a higher pitch, and as it's open, I believe it says it's open, the pitch is lower. So the laryngeal ligaments and the muscles are all bound to the 9 pieces of cartilage that form the larynx. And so we have extrinsic ligaments that are attached to the thyroid cartilage and the hyoid bone, and the cricoid cartilage and the trachea. And this holds the whole laryngeal apparatus together. The vestibular folds cover the vestibular ligaments. Again, this is not the same thing as the vestibular system associated with balance. The vestibular folds and ligaments make up the false vocal cords. These are not a part of the vocal apparatus. Let's see. Here's the vestibular fold. vestibular folds here and here. I was looking for the ligaments on this picture. Here it is. The vestibular ligaments are right internal here. So they're not a part of the vocalization apparatus. And then we have the intrinsic muscles. These are really important for really important for producing vocalizations, because these are the contractions that actually help produce sound. This tightens or loosens the vocal folds so that we can get different pitches out of our voice box. Now moving down, we're going to go to the trachea. The trachea itself is just a very tough but flexible tube allowing air down to the lungs. Each segment has basically C-shaped tracheal cartilages surrounding the trachea itself. It helps keep the trachea open. And then we have little ligaments holding the trachea in place. It helps protect the anterior aspect of the trachea from compression and keeps the trachea open. Also makes room for the epiglottis to expand while we're swallowing things. So here's an example of the trachea, and here are the tracheal cartilage rings holding the trachea open. When you look at the trachea is anterior to the esophagus, which is posterior. I'm just putting A and P here so that you know what anterior and posterior is in this particular picture. And here's a piece of tracheal cartilage right here, a tracheal cartilage ring holding the trachea open. So the trachea should be open most of the time. The trachea itself is. There is some adjacent muscle that can kind of cause a blockage of the trachea, but for the most part, there's not a whole lot of closing of the trachea itself. Asthmatic patients may suffer a little bit of tracheal constriction. Usually what they're feeling, though, is the muscles contracting up in the larynx. You'll be talking about that in physiology. The trachea branch into the right and the left bronchi. Let me get a different color pen for that. The right and the left bronchi are the major pathways. So here is the left bronchi branching down to the left lung. And here's the right bronchus, I should say bronchus, branching out into the right lung. And basically, these primary bronchi separate into secondary bronchi, which then branch into tertiary bronchi that lead down eventually to the alveoli. So the bronchi are both, like I said, occurring as right and left primaries. They branch into what we call extrapulmonary or secondary bronchi. And these also have supportive cartilage rings to hold them open. Now, each bronchus enters at what we call the lung Helius. The lung Helius is basically that first section of lung. It's a groove in the lung that provides access to, yes, pulmonary vessels and nerves. The pulmonary vessels are going to be the veins and the arteries going to the lungs. And then, of course, the nerves are going to be controlling the contraction. And to some degree, feeling. Your lungs do have feeling, but it's not the same type of feeling that you would have on the surface of your body. The right bronchus turns out to be wider than the left. That's just the way it develops. And the lungs themselves are surrounded by the pleura. The pleural cavities reside within the thoracic cavity. So pleural cavities are within the basically upper portion, the upper thoracic cavity. Pleural membranes are really super important. We have the parietal and the visceral pleura. The parietal pleura lines the thoracic wall and the diaphragm. So in other words, the parietal pleura line the body cavity. The visceral pleura cover the lungs themselves and they extend over into the fissures of the lungs. And, sorry, I had to go close the door. And what the pleura are doing is providing a space between the body cavity and the actual lungs. And that space is secreting, yes, a fluid. The fluid allows a smooth slipping of the lungs against the body surface. So here is the outside of the body, or I guess you'd say here's the outside of the thoracic cavity containing ribs and muscle, the intercostal muscles. And then we would have, like I mentioned before, these pleura. Let's make them green here. One layer of pleura. Sorry, my lines are terrible. And between, you would have a nice fluid. And that fluid helps, yes, like we've said before, reduce friction. So these are very delicate membranes, all right? All right, purple is going to be our fluid. Sorry about that. Purple is going to be our serious fluid here. Oops, wrong way. So the visceral pleura is covering the actual lobes of the lung. And then we have the parietal pleura that's associated with, so this red's going to be parietal, this green is going to be visceral pleura. And between you have the fluid. And basically, as we inhale and exhale, the fluid is reducing the amount of friction, thus allowing the lungs to maintain fluidity, maintain its kind of delicate nature. You don't end up getting, let's put it this way, you won't end up getting thick pieces of skin developing on the external surface of the lungs. The lung structure is broken into the apex. The apex is the top. The base is the bottom, which makes sense. And the right lung has 3 lobes, the superior, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe. But the left lung only has 2, the superior and the inferior lobe. The cardiac notch right here is the point in which the heart fits. I am not even going to try to draw a heart, but basically the heart would fit right in here. So the heart is always pointing, the apex, the base of the heart is pointing down to the point of the left lung. We have a medial surface, the cardiac notch, which I mentioned over here. The lobes themselves, superior, middle, inferior. And then the fissures are these little folds among and between each individual lobe. So fissure just means like, division. We have the brachial pulmonary segments supplied by the tertiary bronchus. So here are the lateral surfaces. On the medial surfaces, you're going to see the Helius here. The Helius is where the pulmonary veins and nerves come in. So this particular picture is going to be important to study for your lecture exam. Primary bronchi branch to become secondary, the lobar bronchi, 1 for each lobe. The tertiary bronchi, which are the segmental bronchi, go to each segment, superior, medial, inferior. And then the terminal bronchus end with no cartilage. There's lots of smooth muscle here. This is where you can have contraction of the bronchial pathways, very effective to close down cold air going into the alveoli. And then the respiratory bronchioles end with some alveoli. We have alveolar ducts, which end in alveolar sacs, and each individual alveolus is the little grape terminal, or it's at the terminal end of each alveolar duct, and each alveolus is surrounded by blood vessels so that smooth gas exchange can occur through the respiratory surface lining the alveolus. And guess what those are made of? Yeah, individual squamous epithelial cells. So the alveolar membranes, or the alveolar air sac, is at the end of what we call the bronchial tree. Type 1 alveolar cells, really simple squamous epithelial cells, like I said. They look actually a whole lot like capillaries. The type 2 alveolar cells are called septal cells, and these make something called a surfactant. The surfactant helps keep water from building up inside of the alveoli, because remember, we have a lot of water that's being exchanged back and forth through the respiratory membranes, and so by reducing surface tension, we're able to allow that water to evaporate out into the air that we breathe. There are a lot of macrophages present. Those macrophages are there to consume and get rid of any debris that we inhale. Debris would be like pollen, dust particles, or even bacteria. Capillaries surround the alveolus. That allows oxygen and CO2 to diffuse back and forth through the pulmonary surface, or respiratory surface, I should say. And there's a lot of elastin holding the alveoli in place, allowing for expansion and snapback during breathing. So here's what the inside of an alveolar bundle looks like. So they look like little sacs. This would be a very healthy lung. In a smoker's lung, these alveolar sacs are broken down because smoking breaks down the alveolar membranes. When you look at an artist rendition, you could see over here lots of elastic fibers. Over here we have an alveolar macrophage that can actually go among each individual alveolus. We have a capillary, we have type 1 and type 2 alveolar cells. And so basically what you see here is two cells, a 2-cell distance between your bloodstream and the air that you're breathing. 2 cells, that is the distance between your blood and the outside world. All right, folks, I hope that helps. I will talk to you later for the next lecture.